Welcome to Seafood Matters podcast, Elspeth Macdonald, Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be.
Thank you. How has your career developed from your studies to where you are today?
Oh, it's been a long and winding road, I suppose, but one that I feel has maybe sort of taken me back almost to where I started. So I studied for a master's degree in marine and fisheries science in Aberdeen back in, a long time ago, back in the late 80s. And when I completed that degree, I went to work at the Marine Lab here in Aberdeen. And I was there for about 10 years, I think, doing various things. And then I was increasingly becoming involved in sort of policy-related work, and I was enjoying policy work. I thought that was something that I had a sort of good skill set for, and I liked doing. But of course, at that time, it was long before the days of Teams and remote working, and very much all the sort of policy-related fisheries jobs were in Edinburgh, and I was pretty committed to being up here in the northeast. So I made a move into policy work, but it was away from marine and fisheries matters and much more into a sort of broader sphere of food safety and food standards, which of course fish and shellfish are part of, very important part of our food production and our food chain. But I did work in that area for about 18 years, I think it was, and I did various commodities, if you like, in that role. I did a lot of work with the meat industry, the red meat industry. I didn't do so much with fish and shellfish, although I sort of touched on it in some areas. And so I was there in what was the Food Standards Agency, and then that morphed into Food Standards Scotland in about 2015. And I became the Deputy Chief Executive there. And then, this job came along in 2019, and I thought, that sounds interesting. I think I was quite a good fit in terms of the background I had, and also the sort of skills and the experience that I'd accumulated along the way. So, I made that sort of quite big step away from, if you like, that quite long career in the public sector into coming to work for the industry. So, it's been a bit of a winding road, but I do feel it's been one that's taken me back to almost sort of where I started, back with my studies all these years ago.
Really interesting, and I bet there's not been many dull moments.
Not too many. I think I've been very blessed, actually, in all of my working life. I've always had really interesting things to do. I've always chosen to work in areas that are quite lively and where there's lots of challenges and lots of things that aren't particularly straightforward. And that certainly fits the bill in this job, that's for sure.
I can't help but think the first things I feel when you go through all the different things you did, going to the Marine Lab, being with the Food Standard Agency, it must give you a feeling of almost like power in the role you're in now, knowing the way all that things work, having an insight into how they work.
Yeah, it's not so much power, but certainly having an insight into how things work is really helpful. Sort of understanding how the machinery of government works is really helpful, because I think it helps me to help others in this organisation and in the industry to understand why things might be as they are. So it's helpful to be able to understand, to explain sometimes why something might be going in a particular direction, or why something is taking a long time, or doesn't seem to be happening very quickly, or is happening too quickly. So I think certainly having that insight and all these years of working in, as I say, different bits of the government machinery, albeit always quite sort of at arm's length, always quite far away from the sort of core ministerial offices of power, if you like. I've got a pretty good understanding of how it works. And I also did in my Food Standards Agency days. The Food Standards Agency was a UK-wide body, and I spent a year of my time there actually on a secondment down in London. So again, quite good insight into the Westminster machinery as well as the Holyrood machine. So I think that's certainly been invaluable in terms of trying to think about how you navigate your way around those systems to try and achieve your aims.
Well, I can see it's working, because that photo I've seen recently, I was so pleased to see, here's yourself with just behind you, number 10 Downing Street.
Yes, I've had a few visits there, I have to say. And I had one visit there when I was a civil servant, and I've had several visits, certainly more visits there and more meetings there since I left the civil service. And it's an interesting contrast, I think it would be fair to say. But no, I think it's really important for a sector as ours that is a long way from the corridors of power in Whitehall and Westminster, and is, a relatively small part of the UK industry compared to others, that despite our distance from those places of influence in terms of geography and our, as I say, relatively small size compared to others, that we are still considered important and that politicians want to listen to us. So, yeah, I think it's been really rewarding and heartening to just have that level of access, I suppose, and being able to have our voice heard.
Well, I would take that either, I don't know whether I would say I'm taking a step back or a step forward from that, Elspeth, but I would say from an industry point of view, I felt it really great that you had that connection and working so hard at it, because I've seen you there at number 10, but I've also in recent times seen you with at the exhibition. You spent time with the Scottish, it wouldn't be fisheries minister, I don't think, in the Scottish government. But so you've got that connection, and I'm sure you've got an ear to them and gained respect. Do you feel you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to be able to build relationships like that, where you can have those conversations where people feel that you've got something meaningful to say, that you're bringing useful and important information to them and important views to them, because obviously it's difficult for people who are busy running their businesses every day to be thinking about how can they engage with politicians at all levels. So that's why people like I am here, why organisations like the Federation exist to do that on their behalf. So it's really important that you've got those relationships really at all levels, so that you've got the trust and the confidence of the membership of the associations that make up SFF, and that they feel that you are fairly and accurately conveying their views to government and standing up for their interests. And I think it's important to be able to build those relationships, but to understand that those relationships sometimes will be quite tetchy. There will be difficult times, and there are many occasions, and I'm sure we'll touch on these as we go through our conversation today, where we have to be very critical of government, and we have to be not afraid to be very critical of them when that is necessary.
It's certainly an important role. Very important, and I don't think it must be difficult for you at times when it's a different colour politics. There's talk just now it could be a Labour government. So does that give you issues when you have to change your heart or your approach? Or
no, I don't think so. And I think, again, this is probably where having had a long career in the civil service is quite useful. You had to work with all administrations, regardless of colour, whatever kind of flag or rosette they were wearing, regardless of persuasion, regardless of policy. So you had to be able to be adaptable to work with all of those different flavours of government, if you like, in an impartial way. And I think that is an important thing to carry forward into this role. You have to put your own perspectives and your own views to one side and say, well, actually, I'm here representing the membership, and I'm here trying to do the best job I can, regardless of what the political persuasion and power is at the time, and really trying to get the best outcomes and the best deals for our industry, as I say, regardless of who is in power. Now, obviously, that might be more or less difficult depending on what the policies of any particular government are. And I think it's fair to say that we're quite busy at the moment studying all the manifestos that are coming out from the different parties as we approach the general election. And there's not a great deal really in there at the moment that we've seen that talks much about fishing, despite the fact that I'm sure we and others have been working hard for things that we would have liked to see in the manifestos. But obviously we have to await the outcome of the election, which is in just under 3 weeks' time now, and make sure that whoever is taking the keys to Downing Street, that we are building on the work that we've been doing over the last months and years, in fact, to make sure that we've got relationships not just with the government, but also with the opposition, and that we're ready on day one to start afresh.
Do you feel they're listening?
Yeah, I think. Well, obviously, you have lots of different levels, because obviously there's at the UK government level, within DEFRA, there will be a Secretary of State. And then certainly over the last few years, there has been a Fisheries Minister working underneath the Secretary of State. And he or she has absolutely been listening to the fishing industry because it's a really important part of their portfolio. Obviously, when you go up a layer to the Secretary of State in DEFRA, for example, they've got a much broader brief. They're having to deal with sewage in rivers and the environment and farming and food production, and fishing is just one part of that. But it's important, I think, that we are still having all those conversations at those different layers. I think we have had a good year with the fisheries ministers in DEFRA in the time that I've been in this job, for almost 5 years now, because I think there's a recognition that the fishing industry in Scotland is the biggest part of the UK. We make up probably more than 60% of the UK fishing industry. So therefore, it's important to listen. And of course, fishing's an interesting area because there's a UK issue and there's also a Scottish issue. So there's lots of things about fisheries management that are devolved to Holyrood. And then there's various things that still sit within the UK brief because there are these sort of international negotiations and the international relationships. So it's really important that we are working constructively with both governments, north and south of the border, sometimes for slightly different reasons, but on different policies, I should say, but the overall objective being the same, to try and get the best outcomes for our members here in Scotland.
And would you actually be negotiating with the ministers for your members?
We would be certainly trying to convey what is important to our members and what would be seen as positive things and what would be seen as less positive things. Obviously, ministers have to, particularly at UK level, they have to listen to a wide range of voices, and then they have to decide, how do I balance all of these things and how do I try to deliver something for everyone. So all we can do is make the case for what we would like to see and hope that ministers hear that.
What's your view currently? There's a fear that it's still the same. I'll take you back. I can remember as a kid in the younger days when I was maybe just trying to go fishing. My father was a fisherman, and he used to always say the problem we had, obviously that's before the Scottish government, but he used to always feel that, and it was not just only him, but it was general, that when you look at the complete UK, fishing was such a small percentage of the GDP that they didn't get the ear. It was big as far as the coastal communities were concerned, but it could never get it across the MPs because it was such a small percentage of the GDP.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a small industry. I think, compared to others, if you compare it to the energy sector or the finance sector, we are small in comparison. But it's really interesting how much public support there is to the industry all the same. And I think what matters to the public matters to politicians, because the public votes for politicians. So politicians are always keen to hear what the public think. We've done some polling just quite recently, and we did some again about 6 months ago, and it shows that there's really strong support in the Scottish population for the fishing industry, even in parts of Scotland that aren't particularly connected to fishing. So I think for an island nation like ours, whilst it might be a relatively small industry and hasn't perhaps got the same profile that it might have had when every port in Scotland had a fishing fleet of some sort, that there's still a real pride and value seen in our industry. And I think it's really important that we are continuing to convey that public support to politicians, because, as I say, what matters to the public does matter to those who need the public to elect them.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about your platform, the SFF? it's a big organisation. Big, not big in numbers, but it's big as far as respect within the industry. That might be put pressure on you because it maybe the expectations of people like you are maybe a bit unreasonable. But you go back, I mean, I remember characters like Willie Hay and Robert Allen and people like that. They're big characters.
Yeah, I know. I always feel like you're very much standing on the shoulders of giants. The SFF is a strong body today because of not what I've done in 5 years, but because of what people did in 50 years. And I came into this organisation and very quickly understood the drive and the commitment of people back then in the 70s and through the 80s who, set this organisation up, who have worked hard to build what it is today. And I think we had a great opportunity to celebrate that last year when we celebrated SFF's 50th anniversary. And as part of that, we commissioned a book looking back over the 50 years of SFF. And it was a really interesting piece of work to actually just look at what all the challenges had been in each of these decades and how the individuals involved, the different battles and struggles that they had to be heard and to stand up for the industry. And I think I'm very conscious of the fact that I am, the current custodian of something that has been built and developed and has grown a huge amount of respect externally and across the industry over many, many years. And it's a responsibility. It's a real responsibility to feel that. You feel, you've got to maintain that and hopefully build it even further. So, yeah, I'm very proud to work for this organisation. And I'm very thankful to those who preceded me, who built it in such good heart and has given me the platform that I'm able to stand on today.
When somebody had been in the industry for probably 60 years, you're saying there about you've taken over the mantle in the last 5 years. It's still up there with the same respect, so well done, you. I can see the tireless job you do, and with the various posts on social media, and you've still got the respect, and members still look to you. So that must be important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we obviously represent a pretty broad church in terms of fishing. We represent everything from shellfish and the pelagic fleet. So, it's a very broad membership, and it's about what we have to do is really try and work in the areas where we can find consensus and we can find things that are in everybody's interests. And we're always trying to make sure that we're doing things that are going to benefit as many people as possible.
Would I not be right in saying, yes, it's a broad church as far as the people you represent, but it's much broader and bigger as an organisation than it was, because you've got your own scientists on board?
Yeah, we do. And again, this is a reflection, I think, of the fact that the people who've been running SFF, whether in office bearer roles or in the roles of staff, have, built it into a strong organisation. And we've got a policy team now of 4 individuals here in Aberdeen, one of whom is a fisheries scientist, has a very extensive experience working not just in Scotland, but actually working for the FAO in Rome, and has worked in fisheries internationally. And I think it's really important that we have that in-house expertise, because so much of what we are doing, so much of fisheries management is based on science. And I think the more that we can do to try and sort of bridge that gap between industry and academic science, if you like, or government science, the better that will be. And of course, it's not just SFF that have scientists within their teams now. Some of the associations within membership also have their own scientific expertise, and we try to work as a network, trying to pooling our resources to work on common challenges. And some of the POs also will have scientists working with and for them. So I think we do see a growing network of industry scientists now in fisheries. And I think that's really important, because we are able to be, as I say, that bridge between the formal science, if you like, the science that the government does and the science that the stock assessments, for example, are based on, and also being able to translate that to and from the front line of fishing. So it's, I think, a very forward-thinking move by the industry to start doing this. I think particularly when we see some of the government resources becoming increasingly challenged, as budgets get tighter.
But that we talked about respect earlier, that must give you a better ear and more respect. The fact that when you're presenting yourself to governments, that you're not just a group of moaning old fishermen who are never happy unless they get their own way, but you're taking it to a far greater level very responsibly with your own scientists on board.
Yeah, it's really important because we have to have credibility, and to be credible, you have to be able to be talking from a position of understanding and a position of knowledge. And, there's much about the seas and fisheries that we don't yet know and probably never will, but we are able to have, I think, very constructive and sort of equal footing discussions with many parts of government about the things that we are all wrestling with, because we have that technical and scientific knowledge within our own organisations, and they don't just sit here and never go out into the world. Our senior scientist was away at the World Fisheries Congress in Seattle at the start of this year, because it's really important that we understand not just what's happening here, but also what's happening internationally. And we are plugged into developments in other countries, networking with other scientists, developing those relationships. So it's absolutely essential, I think, in the modern day that we are scientifically literate, and that I think it really adds to our credibility when we're talking to governments or indeed to other bodies about the challenges that we all face in terms of how we manage our seas for the long term.
Would that credibility help you, because the environmental groups seem to have more, I don't know whether you feel they have more than your organisation, but they seem to have a good ear to the politicians and the ministers. Do you feel by having scientists behind your points that must give you that credibility?
Well, it's certainly extremely helpful, because I think it's very often our scientists that we turn to when we're trying to counter some of what we certainly would see as misinformation and misleading information coming from some in the NGO community. And as I say, there's again a wide spectrum of NGO bodies. And I think, again, these bodies themselves are probably similarly drawing on expertise from different disciplines. But again, it's how that information is often presented, I think, that causes us challenges. And that's why we are not slow to call it out when we think that there is information that is misleading, or it's only being partially presented, or it's being presented in a way that we feel is unfair. And we can, I think, what allows us to be able to do that is the fact that we've got this scientific expertise within our own organisations that really helps us to be able to do that sort of analytical piece pretty quickly and say, no, that's not right, and that is not a fair representation of facts. And it also means that, as I say, we've spent a lot of time just now talking about our relationships with governments, but it is also about our relationships with other bodies. There's a wide range of bodies that have an interest in how our seas are managed, whether that's the energy industry, whether it's the aquaculture industry, whether it's the NGO community. And again, being able to be credible with all of those other parties, I think, is really important. And our scientific expertise really helps us to do that.
It must take up your time that you just would rather put to something more positive.
Yeah, it can be frustrating when we feel we're on the back foot and we're having to spend time responding to things that are wrong or are misleading or are unfair or are perhaps all of these things. And I think that's something that we see now with the work that we're doing more proactively through in SFF. You spoke earlier about the social media posts and the sort of campaign work that we're doing. And I think that is us taking an approach of, we want to be more on the front foot. And as you say, spending our time doing those positive things. And I think our our sense of how this is going is really positive. It has really helped us, I think, to be more putting the things out there rather than responding to the misinformation and misleading information that others might want to promote.
I've actually found it fascinating myself because I have the privilege and pleasure to speak to a lot of different people on my podcasts. I've had ICES scientists and various organisations, and now you're speaking to them directly, so you'll know exactly if I'm delusional here. But I've had ICES scientists saying that they have a great relationship with fishermen and they value it and want it. Now, I've had fishermen saying to me, Jim, we don't see it. But the view that I would like to see is, well, it's younger scientists, and maybe, do you think that could come where that would improve?
I think there is progress in this direction, and I think there's two quite good examples of this recently. So you'll recall that 4 or 5 years ago, the ICES advice on North Sea cod was doom and gloom. There was 2 or 3 years of pretty savage cuts in the TAC for cod. The ICES model was saying we have to make these reductions in the TAC because the cod stock is not doing well. And fishermen were saying, oh, we can't avoid the stuff. There's cod everywhere. So I don't know why your model is telling you that the cod stock is not doing well, because there's plenty of cod that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. So we had a fairly, and not just SFF, in fact, very much people like the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association and the Shetland Fishermen's Association very much leading the charge on this, around what the model is telling you, ICES, is not what our members are seeing. So something isn't right. What do we do about this? So I think with sufficient discussion and lobbying by the industry to say the model needs to be revisited, there was what's called an ICES benchmark, which takes a complete refreshed look at the science behind the models. And that benchmark, industry scientists were hugely involved in that benchmark, and it resulted in a complete review of the ICES model for North Sea cod and a very different set of advice being produced last year. There's been a similar exercise this year on monkfish. Again, the ICES advice was starting to spiral downwards on monkfish. And again, industry were saying, well, this doesn't reflect what we are seeing. We think this needs to be looked at. So again, this year there was a benchmark exercise to look at monkfish. And we await to see what the outcome of that will be in terms of the advice later this year for 2025. But I think that is a reflection of what the fishermen at the absolute front line out there at sea, what they are telling us, is then being translated through industry scientists to government to say, look, guys, this needs a rethink. So I think there's progress in that direction. I think there's a long way to go. I think there's still, we would like to see industry being able to be sort of much more quickly and sort of readily involved in that sort of work. But I think we're definitely moving in the right direction.
That's encouraging. Now, it's just exactly as you're saying. I've had a recent podcast with a really long-term good friend of mine and a very responsible fisherman, Alan Addison. He's in the Venture 4. And just exactly it's when you just say what you said there, because the way he says, he's been doing monk surveys for over 40 years. He just can't understand how they can come up with that term, data poor. He says, how long does it take?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the things that we would really like to see. We think, fishermen are at sea more than anybody. They're at sea far more than any research scientist ever is. They know things, they see things, they understand things. They've just got a good sense and a good understanding of the world they work in. I mean, their livelihoods depend upon it. So we would really like to see that sort of knowledge and information being much more embedded into this formal scientific process, because I say there's really nobody that's going to be spending more time at sea thinking about where fish are and how many there are than fishermen whose livelihoods depend upon it. So Yeah, I think there's a huge sort of missed opportunity, really, in terms of how you could have more data and more information. And I think ICES recognise that. And I think, again, we're probably pushing at a bit of an open door, but it's just going to take a bit of time to work out how you can do that in a way that it's robust and it's not just anecdotal. It's how you make that sort of informal information into a robust way that you can use it in a formal process.
Yeah. I mean, even in my time, I see such a difference in the industry, whereas going back 30, 40 or more years ago, it was pub-oriented. That's where everybody ended up after the landing. And you just don't see that now. And a fisherman now, he's a businessman. And the more successful boats is because they're good businessmen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the industry has been through so many tough times and so many changes. And yeah, it is about, how do you come through that? It's through being astute about your business and astute about what you're doing. And I think it's really important that we see people working in the industry as professional people. I think it's too often seen as, oh, well, you could always go fishing. And we hear that sometimes from people when you're trying to encourage maybe the schools to be thinking about fishing as a proper career for people. And that's quite challenging because the perception sometimes is wrong. But you're absolutely right. If you look around any fishing port and look at the investment that people have had to make into their boats, into their businesses, it's not a business for the faint-hearted. And I think, we should be really proud of our fishing industry in Scotland. There's so much commitment, so much professionalism and so much skill in it. It's something we absolutely should celebrate and be proud of.
I couldn't agree with you more on that one. And do you feel, going back to you have your own scientists and that, do you think that is bringing in general the scientist side and fishermen, do you think that is taking them together?
Yes, definitely. I think it absolutely does. We would always be, our scientists don't just sit here in the office doing big sums in their head or reading scientific papers. They're very much needing to have that sort of first-hand information about whether it's about selectivity of gear, whether it's about, what are the fishermen seeing at sea. So I think our scientific teams here, both in SFF and in other parts of the industry where scientists are employed, I think they've got very much a direct relationship with fishermen themselves. They're not 3 steps removed from it.
I thought it was a real bold step, but hugely exciting if it was possible and to carry out. It was a podcast I had with a scientist, I'm sure you'll know him, Mike Kaiser, at Heriot-Watt University. And he felt the way to get round a lot of it would be with quota situations and all that, is for the industry to take ownership.
I think there's much that the industry already does take ownership of. I think we run an observer scheme here in SFF, feeds into the scientific process at Marine Directorate, that then feeds into the scientific work that ICES undertakes. I think when you look at the pelagic industry, they do their own self-sampling programme, and they've built up a very strong relationship, again, with Marine Directorate and with DEFRA and with ICES in terms of provision of data. So I think, that, again, that's probably a bit of a journey that we've started on. I think some of the things that probably get in the way of going further with these things is that there's a lot of regulatory steps and hurdles. So obviously the government have got a lot of legal functions that only they can undertake. And I saw this, a very similar, a parallel, I suppose, in my last role where I worked in food safety, where government had a huge responsibility, whether that was central government or local government, for ensuring that businesses were producing safe food. But really, the biggest responsibility for ensuring businesses produce safe food is the business themselves, because they don't want to be poisoning people or making people ill, because that's not good for business. And they were often frustrated that a lot of the things that they would like to do or could do better themselves were being stymied by the fact that the regulator was sitting there with a whole heap of legal obligations and responsibilities that they had to carry out. And I think there's a similar situation here. I think there's much that the industry would love to be more responsible for and to be more accountable for directly. And I say, I think we're making some steps in that process, but I think there's probably quite a lot of regulatory and legal hurdles that mean it's not easy to do that particularly quickly. But I think it's something that we might see over time. And I think things like technology might make those sorts of things easier. I think maybe as public bodies, maybe if, I don't know, we see a situation at the moment anyway where we know that public spending is constrained and governments have to think differently about how they deliver their functions. And I think those are the sorts of things that might start to perhaps create an environment where you could see that progressing a bit. So I think we've made some steps in this direction, but there's certainly scope for more. It's not just industry not being willing to do it that would be holding that back. I think there's lots of other reasons.
And the discussion we make, where he was coming from as well, and I was mentioning some of the things with the non-UK boats fishing in our west of Shetland, and it's always a bone of contention with fishermen, the fact that they never seem to be boarded, they never seem to be monitored. And he just felt, well, if they wanted to fish in our patch, they would have to buy into that. And rather than just get on to them and not our own boats, they would have to stick to the same rules as our boats would.
Yeah, and I think, again, we see that in some ways. So you might have seen the fact that the government has recently, Scottish Government has brought in legislation that's going to make it a requirement for pelagic vessels to have remote electronic monitoring on their vessels. And the industry said, well, if this is going to happen, if you're going to make this a legal requirement, then you need to make it a legal requirement for everybody who fishes in our waters on the same terms. So, because otherwise it would have been unfair. You'd have been making an unlevel playing field. So that is the case. So when non-UK pelagic vessels are fishing in Scottish waters, they will also have to they will be required to have the same equipment aboard and will be subject to the same rules. So I think that is important. But as I say, I think so much, fishing is a really highly regulated industry. You'll know that yourself. You don't need me to tell you that. And I think so much of that regulation does limit at the moment and does constrain what the industry itself might be able to do. But I think there's no lack of appetite in the industry for taking more responsibility themselves and being more accountable for things. I think there would be a lot of willingness to move in that direction if the landscape allowed that to happen.
Yeah, it's just technology, as you mentioned earlier. Would that be for all boats or just all pelagic boats?
At the moment, that requirement on the remote electronic monitoring is for pelagic vessels, but also for scallop vessels. But the specifications are different in terms of what they'll be requiring.
Yeah, it must get really complicated at times.
Yes, there's literally never a dull moment. I call this an anti-dementia job because there's so many complex things to think about. Your brain gets plenty of exercise.
What's your views with the HPMAs? Nobody feels they've gone away. They feel that the name's been changed and they would just come back.
I think it has gone away for now. I think we hear and see a very different approach currently from the Scottish Government. So I think the Scottish Government, their policy for HPMAs came from their political alliance with the Green Party, with the Scottish Greens. I think we can all be clear about that. It came out of the blue. We were all blown away by it because we'd heard nothing about it previously. And we've actually had a very good working relationship with the government on conservation for a number of years. For a decade, we've been working constructively with them on these things. But the HPMAs, as I say, came as a bolt out of the blue. Nobody knew that was coming. So they proceeded off down this road and put out a consultation just before Christmas, I think it was 2022, and we all were bamboozled by the complexity of that consultation. But when you started to scratch beneath the surface of it, we could see it was built on a house of cards, built on a bed of sand. I'm mixing all my metaphors here. And I think the Scottish Government actually were right and they were brave to step away from it and to say, we've got this wrong. We'll take it away. We won't do it. Now, there is still a huge body of work to do on the existing network of marine protected areas. There's still lots to do there, and that work is ongoing. I mean, I think we have to be very alive to the fact that these proposals might see the light of day in another guise under a different name. But I think the government has really listened to the industry, and not just to the industry, but to communities who said, what's the impact of this going to be? This is crazy. And I think, obviously, politically, the coalition with the Greens has gone. That the government is now governing on a minority basis. And I think the signals that we hear from the current leadership of the Scottish Government are much more about recognising the importance of jobs and the economy. And yes, we must protect the environment. And yes, we must address issues of climate change. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of losing people's livelihoods and having an impact on our sort of socioeconomic status. So I very much hope that continues to be the narrative from government, and that we see that backed up by policies that are sensible and based on evidence, and that people can work constructively with them on. Because, as I say, we did a good relationship previously on the MPAs, the marine protected areas, in terms of what needs to be protected, where these areas might be, what needs to be done, what measures you might need to put in place to protect them. And I think we are sort of getting back to that more constructive place than from this notion of we're going to basically close off at least 10% of our seas to everything. You know, they weren't going to allow anything to happen in them. And when you look at the demands for the use in our seas, that was just going to make an already big problem 10 times worse.
Yeah, well, it was certainly going to be catastrophic what they were planning doing. It's nice to hear from you. Obviously, you talk to politicians. It's good to hear that they have a slightly more responsible approach than that one.
Yeah, I think they listened and they acknowledged that they hadn't got this one right, and they acted on it. And they are very clear that they want Scotland to have a successful, modern, profitable fishing industry. And yes, we have to do that in a way that is compatible with protecting nature and is compatible with how we address issues of the climate crisis. And what I am very much trying at pains to do is to say, I suppose, two things. Firstly, nobody has more vested interest in our seas being healthy than people whose livelihoods depend on it. So if we don't have healthy seas and healthy fish and shellfish stocks, we don't have a fishing industry. So therefore, we have a hugely vested interest in our seas being healthy and productive. But also, we can produce fish and shellfish, seafood, with a really low carbon footprint. So we need to be seen as part of the solution to how we reach net zero, not part of the problem. Because the carbon footprint from wild fish and shellfish stocks, harvesting those, yes, you need fuel to go and catch them, but you don't need to chop down the rainforest to feed them. You don't need to use chemicals and fertilizers to grow them. When you compare fish and shellfish, wild-caught fish and shellfish, like the stocks we have here, to other forms of protein, and indeed to many other forms of food, we are a far more climate smart way of producing food than many other sorts. So I'm really at pains to say to anyone who listen, we have a hugely vested interest in making sure our seas are healthy, and we are part of the solution to the climate challenge, not part of the problem.
Do you know why they're including scallop dredging as well as pelagic into the monitoring?
I think the Scallop Fleet has been adopting remote electronic monitoring on a voluntary basis for a number of years. I think in some ways it helps them to be able to show where they fish, and that's helpful from a sort of marine planning perspective, and helping with, I think, some of the spurious allegations that people make about fishing taking place in areas that it shouldn't. So I think if you've got this electronic monitoring on board, you can actually evidence where you are and where you aren't fishing. And we do hear of spurious reports of people saying somebody was fishing in a place that they shouldn't be. But often that's from a position of not really understanding what the actual rules and requirements are.
You know, Elspeth, I have a lot of really close friends, scallop dredgers, and I've sympathies with them. I had the Captain's Galley seafood restaurant in Scrabster for 20 years. And as and when at certain times of the year, depending on the season, the scallop dredgers would be landed in Scrabster, and I would be getting scallops from them. On the odd occasion, I would get dived scallops. Now, and this is not coming from a high place or trying to, this is actual fact of things in front of my eyes. I've had undersized scallops from divers, and I've never had a single one from a dredger. And when I've spoken to a number of them about it, the undersized for a diver depends on how greedy or honest he is. Whereas the dredger, they don't even get them, and they don't even catch them, they escape.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation about scallop dredging, and I think, you know, people in that sector probably rightly feel quite hard done by in terms of saying, you know, if a scallop isn't hand dived, then you shouldn't be eating it. You know, that's just a really unfair representation, I think, of reality. Scallop dredging is a perfectly legitimate form of fishing. It's a really important part of our shellfish fleet. Employs a lot of people and feeds a lot of people. And again, I think there's all sorts of very misleading information out there in the public domain. And I think certainly with when you look at the price premium that people can claim on a hand dive scallop, you can see why there's appeal perhaps to get into that. But no, I think we must do all that we can to remind people that dredge scallops it's an efficient way to harvest seafood. It's a perfectly legitimate way to harvest seafood. And interestingly, actually, I just saw a scientific paper published earlier this week by a team working actually in Mike Kaiser's group in Heriot-Watt University. And they're looking at developing scallop gear that has a lower impact on the seabed. So again, just really interesting to see all of that sort of innovation and industry and scientists, again, working collaboratively to see if you can develop gear that can continue to catch the right species at the right sizes, the sorts of things we've just been speaking about, but can perhaps have a lower impact on the seabed. So I think there's still some work to do there, but it's a really interesting development. And I think, again, it's showing how the industry and academia can work to look forward and not just always think, just because this is the way we've always done something, this is the way it always has to be, always looking for ways to improve things.
You know, it's interesting when I hear you saying that, Elspeth, because it just shows how serious the industry's taking things and all the different groups involved, because you're saying there about what Heriot-Watt are doing with that scallop dredging, and also, is it fishing innovation with their smart trawl? They're trying so hard.
Oh yeah, I mean, smart trawl is potentially a game changer. You know, I think if smart trawl can work at commercial scale, it would be a terrific innovation. And again, you know, our industry has been involved in helping with the trials of smart trawl. Obviously, they have to try it on actual fishing vessels. We were a partner in fisheries innovation for a number of years, and would love to see that project come to fruition. And again, it's looking very much at how you can adopt absolutely cutting edge technology, you know, AI technology, and apply it in the context of a demersal fishing boat, you know, fishing west of Shetland or wherever. So somebody said to me just recently, tell me how you see how the fishing industry might change. And I said to them, the fishing industry is changing all the time. It's constantly adapting to the environment that we operate in. You know, you don't have control over what fish are in the sea, so therefore we can only catch what's available and what we've got quota for. And fishermen are always going to be looking at ways to how they can improve how they do things, how they can be more selective with the gear, how they can burn less fuel, how they can improve their businesses all the time. So and smart trawl is just a great example of where as I say, if you could marry together that cutting edge technology with the practical reality of demersal mixed fisheries, it would be a terrific achievement if that can be commercialised.
On that note, what's your vision of the future of the fishing industry?
My vision, what I would really love to see is this industry continuing to be a successful one. You know, as I said earlier in our discussion, I think Scotland should be really proud of the industry that we've got. You know, it's full of people who are highly professional in what they do, who are highly committed to what they do, and are really good business people, you know, prepared to take risks. You have to be able to prepare to take risks in fishing. You take risks every day actually going fishing, but also you take huge business risks in getting into this industry because there are so many uncertainties and things that you can't control. So I would really hope that our industry continues to be full of people like that, who are forward thinking and progressive. I think technology and things like smart trawl, for example, might help the industry become ever more selective and able to be perhaps more targeted in what we're able to catch. But again, when you work in the context of mixed fisheries, that can be quite difficult. What I would really love to see is just a wider appreciation of what our industry does and what it produces. I think what is really heartening is that really positive feedback we always get through the polling that we do, that the public really supports us. But I think sometimes there are too many detractors for our industry who want to talk it down and say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this and we shouldn't be having trawl fisheries and, you know, these things aren't good. They are good. They're producing food, they're feeding people. I would like to see a future whereby the industry is very positively regarded for the contribution that it makes to food security and the contribution that it makes towards reducing the challenges that we all face with climate change.
No, it's nothing much more you could add to that. But I think we actually see that. That's not just a hope or...
Yeah, I think those of us who are close to it see it. But I think sometimes if it's not an industry that you spend too much time fishing about, and you maybe just pick up the newspaper and the Good Fish Guide is saying you shouldn't eat cod from the North Sea or crab from somewhere because of there might have been an entanglement issue. You know, I think we have to understand, and we have to we have to have a future where people understand that you can't have any form of food without some kind of impact. All food production has some kind of impact, but it's about how we get that right balance between protecting the environment, protecting our communities, and ensuring that we've got a sustainable economy. And I think it's, you know, the trick for the future will be having the right policy landscape that allows all of those things to be achieved. And we can't do that by demonising any part of our industry.
One of my scallop dredger friends always says, look, I've been well over 40 years on this job. And he says, over the course of the year, as you know, Elspeth, they're going right round the British Isles. They'll be with us up in Scrabster. They'll be down the East Coast, finish, maybe end up in the Channel for a while, and then they'll be back up the West Coast, right round the UK. And fishing, not the same grounds all the time, but the same grounds at the certain seasons. And he says, for over 40 years I've done that. He says, so what's not sustainable about that?
Exactly. And, you know, much the same is true of, again, if you look at our demersal grounds, you know, they've been fished for decades and they're still really productive. In fact, you know, the set of ICES advice that we've got for this year, the 2023 advice for fishing opportunities this year, some of the best advice that we've seen in decades. So we are fishing sustainably. We are fishing at levels that the grounds can maintain. And, you know, these are productive areas where we can produce food. And we must make sure that we can continue to produce food, because food security is going to become ever more important as we have a growing population in the world and with a higher and higher requirement for seafood to help meet that.
Yeah, when you mention the MPAs, I remember bringing it up in a podcast with Mark Dickie-Colas from ICES and asked him about closed areas. And even, you know, sometimes you'll hear, ICES scientists, they're all negative. But even he says, you can't close an area and just leave it. He says, you've got to keep monitoring it. That's a real fear just now because although the HPMAs are scrapped, they're still MPAs. And I don't think any of them are being monitored.
Well, I think there's a general concern about the amount of resource there is for doing proper monitoring. And I think that's a widespread issue, because if you're going to make any management changes, whether it's MPAs or whatever, what's your baseline? What are you starting from? What are you trying to achieve? And you need to have a lot of data to do that. And I think we are concerned that, the current difficult financial landscape that we see in the public finances is going to make some of this difficult in terms of how much resources government going to have to do this. And that's why come and speak to us in the industry. We know a lot, we're out there all the time, we see a lot, we have huge amounts of experience and knowledge, and we should be able to harness that better and make use of it.
Yeah. I'm going to put you in a spot now. You're home, getting a meal ready for the family, nice bit of seafood. What would be your choice and your favourite?
In the summer, it's quite hard to beat a mackerel straight out of the sea and onto the grill, onto the barbecue, like a fresh mackerel. And a nice big chunk of halibut. Yeah, they always go down well. Yes.
You're a halibut person.
Love a halibut. I like most whitefish, I must say, but yeah, I like a halibut. My husband is Irish, and he fished himself many, many moons ago, and he can't often see past a John Dory.
Oh, I love a John Dory. Yeah. I had a guy in a restaurant once, and I think this will maybe have you a little smack in your lips. I quite often, when I had the restaurant and I'd go around tables, they would be asking me, what's your favourite seafood? And I always, to a degree, didn't like answering it, because I used to feel if picking one out, it's doing a disservice to the others. And this guy was telling me the best experience he ever had. And I just put my hands up and says, look, there's no restaurant will emulate that. He was out fishing. Now, you could picture the scene, out on a lovely calm day with a pal, rod fishing. They were in amongst mackerel. They were taking them on board. They fancied eating one. They had no cooking facilities on board. So what are they going to do? They got a bit of foil, and they wrapped the mackerel in the foil and with a wire strapped it onto the manifold of the engine and cooked it.
Perfect. What's not to that? It's reminding me actually of when I was in the Marine Lab doing a trip on the West Coast somewhere many, many, many years ago. And when we were busy doing our scientific measurements, the crew were lining for mackerel, and they had a wee smoker aboard. Yeah. And we were tied up every night. It was just a wee inshore boat somewhere, and we would go ashore and we would have a pint and come back and then have a feast of freshly smoked mackerel that they'd just caught that day. Happy days.
I remember one of the old kilns when Aberdeen was in its heyday, and there was a company I dealt with, and they used to smoke the mackerel whole. And honestly, I don't think I've ever tasted anything so delicious. I still taste it.
Yeah, no, we're very lucky to have such a wide range of fabulous fish and shellfish that comes from our seas.
Yeah. Well, Elspeth, I'd just like to thank you so much. Honestly feel, listening to you, the industry's in a good place, so well done. Well,
thank you, Jim. That's very kind, and I certainly hope that I'm doing my best for the industry, and I hope that they feel that too. But it's a tremendous industry to work within. It's a great privilege to do this job, and I enjoy it immensely. And it's been great speaking to you today.